One of the things that have always confused me in this modern era of publishing, reading, and writing is the idea of trigger warnings at the beginning of books. Should authors supply trigger warnings for their readers? Here's my thoughts about it. Hi, Hi, I'm Parker J. Cole, and I am an author, podcaster, and speaker. And this is my series of writerly thoughts as someone who has been writing since 2011. I've made tons of mistakes. I've written over 40 books, probably 50 books now. I've done speaking engagements. I've been at conferences. I've really tried to get better at this thing called writing. And it's not that I have arrived yet, but I just want to share with you my writerly thoughts about writing, and it's going to go over a huge plethora of ideas. So today I do want to talk about trigger warnings. Find trigger warnings, like I said at the beginning of this episode, interesting. Back in the day when you picked up a book, you picked up the book and you were going to read it no matter what was included in the story. There were no trigger warnings. There were no readers need to be aware that this book talks about this controversial thing, or this book is going to explore this thing. And I find trigger warnings to be sign of the modern reader, where the modern reader is put at the center of the storyteller's job as opposed to the story. And this shift from making the story the center of the storyteller and making the audience the center gives us some interesting things to explore. For one thing, if I am a storyteller, my job is to present to you a story that will hopefully entertain you, that will broaden your horizons, give you escapism for today. If you're having a bad day or if you just need something to relax with. I, as a storyteller, should not be interested in how you feel about the story. And this is seen as not being, I'm trying to find the right word. This is seen as not catering to the audience. And I don't think as an author, you should cater to your audience. You should cater to people who want to read your stuff. And that's why I'm a huge advocate of writing what you want to write and not letting anyone else dictate what you write. For example, with trigger warnings, especially in the romance genre, which I am a part of, I write sweet historical romance and general market historical romance for the most part. In the romance genre, they'll have trigger warnings saying this story talks about, let's say, essay, or this story talks about abuse, this story talks about domestic violence, this story talks about um, whatever you want to put in there. And some people really appreciate those trigger warnings, but I think it takes away from the excitement of learning what this story is about. I did have an experience, though, with a reader who read one of my earlier books. It was called The Cure. And The Cure is my contemporary sweet romance that takes place here in Michigan. And in the story, I think chapter one, we find out that the main character is at a hospital because her niece was burned in a daycare fire, her and her friend. And they're like 3 years old. And they got caught in the fire, and the little girl went to go help her friend and she got caught in the fire too. Now, I did not get extremely graphic about the injuries that the little girls experienced, but you can tell they were badly hurt. And it's in chapter one, so it's not a spoiler or anything. And a reader contacted me and said, I could not finish your book because I have too vivid of an imagination. And I kept thinking about those poor little kids being burned in a fire. And I remember thinking, well, the children aren't dead, they're alive. They actually uh, spurned the plot for that particular book. But it was until then I realized that some people do have certain sensitivities to certain topics. Whereas I'm not sure how that happened because back in the day, I've read lots of different books that have been startling or controversial. I didn't need a trigger warning. I just accepted the book for what it was. It's this message that I'm going to accept. So, as an author, should you include trigger warnings if you know your book is going to have something controversial? Now, I hope I don't sound like I'm being hypocritical because I'm not. Recently, I released a book called Ursula's Wedding Dilemma. And in that book, I was very much overtly talking about spiritual warfare from a biblical point of view. And that was the book God told me to write. It was one story that I was hesitant to write, which I shouldn't be, God forgive me, but I was hesitant to write because of some of the things I'm talking about. And I said, well, most of my readers who know me, they know I usually write um, um, wholesome um, romances. But this was talking about spiritual warfare, so it gets a little dark, has a little gothic feel to it. And I did say, for those who used to me, this is a lot different than what I usually write. Just letting you know. And I had one reader say, I hated this book. She left she left that 1 star on Amazon for what seemed like a million years. And I had to stare at it because I can't say anything about it. It's her opinion. She hated the book. And she even said in her review, I don't know who this person is. I'm assuming she's a she, who knows? But she said in her review, I want this author to go back to what she writes. So again, if you notice the shift to how that reader wants me, or wants the author, I should say, to write what they want to hear about, you know. And if we're storytellers, we're going to write the stories that come to us. Sometimes those stories aren't always sweet. Sometimes they aren't always um, sanitized. Sometimes they're gritty and dark. Sometimes they deal with some really hard issues, and there's nothing wrong with that. And this particular story, I knew I was being led by God to actually write that story. And I went ahead and did it. And I had someone reach out to me, and that story was for them. The story that I wrote was for them. And if that was for one person to be blessed by that story, that was it. So, should you, we got a little off track there, should you put trigger warnings in your books? It depends. I personally don't do that because of what I write, but even if I wrote something more grittier, I wouldn't do that either because books are meant to be discovered. You're supposed to find out what this art is. I don't think we should make the audience the center of what we do. I mean, yeah, they propel our careers forward. We do want them to read our stories, but our job is to tell the story, not to tell the story that the audience wants to read, but the story that's inside of your heart. Now, of course, I've seen toxic, and I hate using that term because it's so misused, but for the lack of a better term right now, I've seen toxic fandoms of high profile romance authors get kind of crazy with some of them. I'm going to use Nora Roberts again from my other video as an example. She had a couple in her book, and the readers wanted the couple to have a baby. And she said, no, this couple is not going to have a child. Now, you have to remember, these people aren't real. They're just characters in her book and her stories. But the readers were so upset that she would not give this couple a child. And she said, this couple doesn't need one for whatever reason. And the readers were so upset with Nora Roberts deciding not to do this, they actually started attacking her assistant, who takes care of all her social media interactions and messages and posts, stuff like that. So Nora Roberts herself had to get on her own social media and tell off these toxic fandom readers that she is going to write the story she wants and she's not going to be dictated to by the audience. And some readers were highly upset about that because they feel as if we keep you in business because we are the readers who want your story. If we want a child from this couple in your story, that's what we want. Now, let me tell you something. On one hand, I don't think there's an author on the planet who wouldn't mind having such a rabid fan base. I don't think there's one. I think they would love to have a lot of indie authors and small authors would love to have that type of rabid fandom, you know. The other side of it is that you have to decide what the story is. The audience is going to appreciate the story, right? But you decide what that is. So I really am an advocate for author autonomy. I really am. And maybe one day I'll get into that a little bit deeper. But you decide that story. So if you want to put trigger warnings on your book, you can because you understand your readers, especially if, you know, some stuff can get kind of gritty. But again, for me, that's the whole point. I'm discovering what the story is. But I did talk to a few people, as like some Christian authors who don't want to read gritty stuff. They do appreciate having the trigger warnings at the beginning of the book. Like they said, this book will have this, and they can decide they want to read the book. Then again, maybe that's another question for another time. If you constantly prepare the reader for the story instead of them discovering that story for themselves, you know, is that really what you want to do? So, what do you think, guys? Do you think authors should put trigger warnings at the beginning of their books? Go ahead and let me know in the comments below. Make sure you like and subscribe and follow, and I'll see you again next time for another Parker's Writerly Thoughts.